You're listening to the Shared Security Podcast with Tom Eston and Scott Wright, exploring the trust you put in people, apps, and technology.
Hosted by Scott Wright, the Streetwise security coach, and Tom Eston, penetration tester and ethical hacker. And sponsored by Security Perspectives, your source for tailored security awareness training and assessment solutions. We bring you stories, advice, and tips to help you make better risk decisions because nobody else can make them for you.
Episode 51, Online Behavioral Advertising. How Canada's Privacy Commissioner is keeping Google and other advertisers accountable for ads that use tracking.
Hello and welcome to the Shared Security Podcast, episode 51 for, what is it today, Tom? It's February 10th, I believe. Yeah. So we're keeping a good momentum going with our episodes, keeping things rolling. How are you doing these days?
I'm doing good. I'm enjoying the beautiful snow that has fallen here in Cleveland.
Yeah, we've actually had a great winter here in Ottawa as well, but it's going to be pretty darn cold this weekend.
Well, tomorrow it'll probably be 60 degrees and then back down to 10. So that's Cleveland weather for you.
Yeah, well, for us it's going to be minus 25. So
yeah, that's a little cold.
Yeah, Celsius. Of course, I have to add.
Oh,
that,
Celsius.
Yes.
Got it.
At minus 40, it's exactly the same. It doesn't matter
That's
whether
right.
it's Fahrenheit or
It's
Celsius.
very cold.
It's just too freaking cold. So anyway, it's been a pretty good winter and it's almost over, I think. At least I'm hopeful that way.
Hopefully.
Okay, so this week we've got some special stuff to talk about. We were hoping to get it on for the 50th celebration, our 50th episode, but better late than never. We have an interview with Andrew Patrick coming up from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, which is really interesting, and we're going to be talking about online behavioral advertising, or as some of us just call it, ad tracking, and how its implications on privacy and personal information. So that's going to be a great discussion, I think. And after that, we're going to get into a few of our normal news topics. What do we have in store, Tom?
So we'll start by talking about the security issues that are being found in all these new toys that us parents are buying our children these days, especially younger children. So we'll talk about a recent vulnerability that was found in a Fisher-Price smart toy, as they're called. So a little bit of the Internet of Things and how issues in these products can affect really our children and their privacy.
Yeah, that should be quite interesting. We'll also have a little discussion about somebody who, as a mother, was able to thwart a predator from stalking her daughter, and develops into a more interesting story. And we have some tips that go along with generally how do you deal with this kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into an article that we sent out here through our social media just in the last week or so about the top 15 most dangerous applications that hopefully are not, but that on your children's devices, but that kids are installing. And it's just a good way to, or really, I think we'll have a good discussion on what parents need to do to monitor these applications and how they're using their devices.
Excellent. And then we're going to wrap things up with just a little discussion about a news story that was featured in CBC News here in Canada, and they interviewed me for a discussion on privacy and connected devices, and just some of my observations after the fact on some of the comments we received from that story. So hopefully we'll open some eyes and get people thinking in the right direction based on those comments. So without further ado, let's get on with this very busy episode. We're going to start with my discussion coming up with Andrew Patrick from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So let's get him on the line. Okay, I'm on the call now with Andrew Patrick from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So how are you doing today, Andrew?
I'm fine, Scott, and how are you?
Not too bad. It's great that we're able to have you on the call today, and looking forward to discussing a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, online behavioral advertising. Is that right?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work understanding how advertisements are placed on the web and the privacy issues associated with targeting advertising.
Excellent. So before we get into that, though, let's spend a moment and talk about the role of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, and what can you tell us about it?
So the office, the OPC, is the federal authority for protecting the privacy rights of Canadians. Canada has a collection of fairly strong privacy laws that protect different forms of personal information, whether it's information that's collected by companies, information that's collected by governments, by healthcare providers, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada is the federal office which covers federal issues, cases where there's no specific provincial or territorial legislation. And
Okay.
in particular, the office enforces two federal laws in Canada, one covering the private sector, which is called PIPEDA, and one covering government activities, federal government activities, and that's the Privacy Act.
Okay. So we're going to talk mostly today, in the case of online behavioral advertising, about things related to PIPEDA, right? So let's see if we can define that, first of all, what it involves.
So PIPEDA is the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Document Act, and it's what sets out the requirements for commercial organizations as they collect and use personal information from Canadians. And it basically sets out a series of requirements or principles that outline good practices for managing privacy.
Okay, great. So that sets the stage for us, and I think we've had a chance to look at some of the publications that the OPC has issued lately in the area of online behavioral advertising, which I think is really interesting. So let's for a minute look at why online behavioral advertising, or we'll call it OBA, is of interest to the Privacy Commissioner.
Well, you've probably all seen as you go around the web and visit different websites that certain kinds of advertisements appear more frequently based on what you've been doing in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've been looking a lot at pet stores or pickup trucks, then you probably notice that you start to see a lot of ads for pet stores or pickup trucks.
Yep.
In an earlier policy analysis, we said, look at the information that's being collected there to target the ads to you. That's personal information. That's information about you. That's quite personal. And any time that an organization is collecting personal information, then Canadians must be given control over that personal information. So the bottom line here is it's an issue of control. It's an issue of consent.
Right.
What is the form of consent that's appropriate such that people can have some control over this form of targeted advertising?
Mm-hmm. And just before we go too far there, just a distinction, I think, between targeted advertising and relevant ads, right? So if you're on a web page that's talking about pets, you're likely to see ads related to pets, right?
Yeah, that's generally called contextual ads, because the ads are directly related to the context of the page you're on. Mm-hmm. Whereas OBA, the ads are related to your accumulated viewing over a number of websites and perhaps a long period of time.
Okay. So yeah, that sounds more complicated to implement, but probably, I guess, more profitable if they're able to do it.
Yeah, it certainly is. What we hear is that these are more effective ads because they can be more relevant to people's long-term interests, but they are more complicated. They're more complicated in order to place, and they certainly were more complicated for us to test.
Right. So, what we're going to do in the podcast, we have show notes that we usually issue with our audio, and in that, we're going to put some links into the articles that you provided with us to us about OBA, which I think are really very informative. And one of them is quite interesting. It's an in-depth look at a case study around a complaint that someone had about Google's AdSense advertising placements related to health devices, I guess we'll call it.
Yeah, these were particularly CPAP devices, which are continuous positive airway pressure, which are used by people who suffer from sleep apnea and other disorders, and it allows them to get a better night's sleep.
Okay, so this person basically had been, I guess, searching for that kind of a product at one time or other, or information about them, and then later on discovered that as he visited different sites, he was seeing more and more ads for these things pop up on really irrelevant sites.
Right. The sites that he was seeing this was everything from going to check the news to the weather, a wide variety of sites, and the pervasiveness of the CPAP ads was quite remarkable. When we replicated his claims in our laboratory, it was really quite striking how many CPAP ads that we saw.
Okay, so and what did the OPC do when they saw this, or when you saw this discrepancy? Were you able to approach Google about it and find out more?
Yeah, the first step was, of course, to figure out who is placing the ads. So we have to look at the source code, the HTML of the web pages, to look to see which organization is actually delivering that ad content. And in this case, it turned out to be Google. And so we approached Google and explained to them what the complaint was, what we were seeing, and then engaged in a process with Google to figure out what was happening, what services they have that were delivering these ads, and then getting them to appreciate why we were concerned about it and what should be done about it.
Okay, so I guess it turns out that they did appreciate, or they did understand the concern?
They did. It took a little bit of back and forth to figure out exactly how these ads were being placed. As you can imagine, Google, which services lots and lots of ads, has a number of different advertising methods and advertising programs.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out in this particular case, these ads were coming for what's called remarketing or retargeting, which means that they were ads for stores that the individual visited directly. So they were actual CPAP stores as opposed to ads generally for CPAP devices. It was ads for stores that he had actually gone to, and that's called remarketing or retargeting.
Okay, so yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, when people have a chance to read the article, to see the level of detail that the OPC went into in trying to verify the behavior and the recommendations that were made, I thought it was quite interesting and impressive, that Google did eventually sort of understand and put some effort into responding, or at least trying to explain and hopefully responding. But it was interesting that, given that they were that cooperative, what would have been the consequences if they had not cooperated?
It's a good question. There's basically two consequences. One is the ability to basically name and shame. The commissioner has the discretion to name a company publicly, as was done here when the investigation was complete, in order to make the world aware that this is the behavior of the company. If the company chose not to comply, and we have had cases of that, then it can act as a warning to people who are potentially considering partnerships with those companies, to be aware of what their practices are.
Right.
So that's the first method, is just if there isn't good cooperation, just naming and shaming. But the second is we can go to court. We can go to federal court, and we can ask the court to make the organizations comply. In most cases, we don't need to do that.
Right.
It's something that we try to avoid because it's expensive and time-consuming. But it is an option for us. It also, by the way, is an option for the company. If the company doesn't agree with our recommendations, they can also go to court and challenge what we've done. So
Right.
the ultimate consequence is a case in the federal court.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, just getting back to this case now, when we look at it more carefully, what were the key recommendations that the OPC made to Google that you felt they needed to change?
Well, the first issue, the primary issue, is the interest that the person had exhibited, the interest that was being used for targeting, is what we would consider to be a sensitive topic. It's about his health care. It's about devices that he's interested in for health care. And our policies and Google's own policies say, look, it's not appropriate to profile people and target people on the basis of sensitive information, particularly for medical information. And so they agreed that this was the case, and they agreed that they would stop this form of advertising and similar forms of advertising that were clearly related to medical issues.
Okay, go ahead.
More generally, the issue was, how are they keeping track of what their advertisers are doing? What are their management programs? What are their review programs? And so they also agreed that they needed to beef those up such that they had a better idea and stronger ability to keep track of what advertisers were doing.
Sure. Okay. And it also sounded like there was a strong recommendation or a position that the Privacy Commissioner has, I guess, quite often or almost always with OBA, and that is that the opt-out option or mechanism is not appropriate when you're dealing with sensitive topics, right? People need to be aware of when information is being collected about them.
That's absolutely right. The key issue is the form of consent. Opt-out consent, where there's a default to consent unless someone says otherwise, is, we have said and ruled repeatedly, for very specific circumstances. And if you don't, non-sensitive information, not children, not vulnerable populations, etc. And if you don't fall into those particular limited circumstances, then opt-in or explicit consent is required. So an organization could get explicit consent for advertising on the basis of these topics. But the key finding was that it's not appropriate to use an opt-out consent model.
Right. And opt-out just sort of means you sort of assume that they're collecting it unless you go searching for a way to make them stop, right?
Right. And in a follow-up report that I think you'll also link to for the listeners, we did a follow-up to look at what forms of these opt-out services are being made available to people.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. I had a chance to look at that, and I've seen things called ad choice, but I didn't realize what it was. And it's a very interesting mechanism people should be aware of and learn how to learn about the ads that are being presented to them and how to opt out of them if they can.
Right.
So it was kind of interesting also to see that Google, from what I know of them, they try to automate pretty much everything, right, to get the most return on their investment. And what they can't automate, they kind of say, well, we're not taking any responsibility for that. But you sort of have to be able to hold them to some standard in this case when it comes to their relationships with the advertisers who are their clients, right?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say that they tried to shirk the responsibility. Once we had a clear understanding of what was happening, they owned the problem. They understood that this was their problem. They have an environment, as you said, that they're working at such a scale that they have automated a lot of things, but there wasn't a shirking of ownership. They clearly said, this is our problem. We have to put tools in place to make sure our advertisers are behaving appropriately.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Great. Excellent. So I guess the other thing is, OPC is not the only organization that's holding the advertisers' feet to the fire. Who else should people be aware of that are in this space?
Well, the U.S. has continually expressed interest in this kind of advertising and other kinds of advertising. For this particular investigation, we did work with the FTC in the U.S., and also the FCC is getting more interested in internet services generally.
Okay.
But also in Europe, the European privacy protection authorities have long had an interest in this, and there are particular hot issues right now in France and Belgium concerning, again, collecting information for the purposes of targeting advertising. So there's lots of organizations who are also attempting to ensure that there's good privacy practices.
Oh, good. Also, I get the feeling that this is going to be kind of like a cat and mouse game. Like there's always people who are going to try and find better ways to advertise to people, and that always kind of, in some ways, seems to infringe on our privacy a little bit. Is it going to be like that, or do you think we'll get some good control under the situation?
I think the control is improving. I think there's, as we found in our recent follow-up study, there's always room for improvement, but it is improving. But we are watching other developments as well. So there's different forms of tracking that are starting to emerge. Tracking that doesn't involve the placement of cookies, what's often called cookieless tracking, that, for example, profiles the browser by its configuration and its behavior. Yep. And those things we're watching because how are users going to be given control when they can't delete their cookies, or going into incognito mode doesn't help.
Right.
Because there's different forms of targeting going on. So on the one side, I think we're seeing good developments, but there are some other things that we're keeping an eye on.
Excellent. Good. Well, it's good to know that there is somebody watching out for us and for our privacy in that sense. And just wanted to sort of give you a last word or any comment that you'd like to let people know who might be listening and concerned or have questions about the OBA concept itself or the OPC.
Well, OBA is interesting, and we tried to cover this in some of our reports. I mean, OBA gives the opportunities for the advertisers that you see online to be more relevant to what you're interested in. And so some people hate all forms of advertising. Some people are, kind of appreciative when the ads that they see are relevant to them. But the key issue is control. Those different people who have different wants and different attitudes should have the tools available to them so that they can control what kinds of advertising they see. Now, on some services, particularly free services where they are advertising supported, they may not have the ability to turn off all advertising, but they should at least have the ability to control whether those are advertisements are based on behavior that's been collected across sites and over time. So it's really a matter of understanding the whole advertising environment and making sure that people have the right to make good choices.
Yeah, actually raises another question in my mind around a topical topic of ad blockers that has been up and around for the last few months. I think at least the last 6 months I've heard of them being very important in discussions. Does the OPC have a position on ad blockers?
No. All that we've been recommending is that people become familiar with the tools that are available to them, and that includes settings that are available within the browser themselves. So, for example, whether their browser will accept cookies automatically, will ask every time, whether third-party cookies are handled differently than first-party cookies. And we also encourage people to take advantage of opt-out services that are available, but also to look at plugins that might be available for their browser and so on. So the advice is more general, which basically says explore the options that are available to you.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Andrew, and I appreciate the Privacy Commissioner allowing us to pick your brain and learn a little bit more about what you're doing.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, and hopefully we'll get you on again another time and talk about some other aspect of privacy that you're interested in.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye. Okay, we're back, and we really appreciate Andrew getting to talk with us about online behavioral advertising, or OBA. And we are going to put some links in the show notes that are giving some good information about the investigations and the positions that the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has been working on. So look forward to getting comments on that if you have any. This is dealing with more or less Canadian issues right now, but I think it affects everybody, and I think it's really good to see the kinds of negotiation with companies like Google, for example, that are in the forefront of the advertising industry. So let's move on now to the next story, which is security issues with connected toys.
Yes, smart toys that are stuffed bears that have security vulnerabilities. Yeah, I think this is interesting, and this has been a new area that just in the last year or two, I've been seeing more of these articles and more security researchers coming out and saying, hey, I found this vulnerability in this toy that kids are using. And I don't think we mentioned this on the show, but do you remember the VTech? Those are those kind of like iPads for kids, I guess I would call them.
Yeah.
They had a pretty serious vulnerability in that product, which made headlines last year. And of course, it happened to be right around the holidays, of course, when parents are buying these toys. And so a similar issue was just announced with Fisher-Price, who makes this Smart Bear. And essentially what the Smart Bear is it has
Don't tell me it's smarter than your average bear.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, Scott. In fact, this Smart Bear uses image and voice recognition technology really to identify the child's voice, read these smart cards that start different games and other activities that the kid can do, while they're playing with the bear. Seems innocent enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a company called Rapid7 in the United States that does security research came out and said they found some vulnerabilities in the way that the Smart Bear talks to the application that will make calls through an API to Fisher-Price's servers, and found that basically anybody could connect to these servers and query information about what these bears were talking about, what maybe your child was talking about. Kind of open up a lot of issues around privacy.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that Fisher-Price did take some action and did fix the issue that they found, which is a great thing. Another reason for really, I kudos to Fisher-Price for having a good vulnerability disclosure policy, about these things. But again, it goes back to even down to the toys that your kids may be playing with can have these privacy and security vulnerabilities, and it's becoming a lot more common.
Yeah, and it sort of follows almost directly from the conversation we just had with Andrew regarding the fact that for online behavioral advertising, where they're talking about collecting personal information and tracking you based on your behaviors, the Privacy Commissioner's position was that you can't use an opt-out strategy for that, which means you have to have explicit disclosure of your intent to collect information and use information. So I wonder how they're going to deal with that. I think in the future what we'd like to see is any toy manufacturers that build toys that do collect and use information from children has to be somehow explicitly disclosed to the people buying it, for sure, that that's what's happening with this device. Big disclaimers like you see on the cigarette boxes when you buy the product. It's an interesting idea.
That is, yeah. And I was just going to mention too, just after the interview with Andrew, that kudos to the Canadian government for really taking a strong stance on privacy. I mean, we don't have anything like the Privacy Commission in the United States, and I know there's legislation and other things that are kind of taking place in the American process, political process, which is always interesting. But I think it's good that there are going to be more things coming out like that, and that the government is kind of taking a stance on that.
Yeah, exactly. And putting out their, rules, or guidelines at least for organizations to follow to know what's right or wrong. And Andrew said that they did work with the Federal Trade Commission and FCC on some of this, the investigation of these issues. So yeah, it is good to see some of the authorities stepping up for those issues.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that with these issues, when we're talking about children's toys, seem to garner a lot more, I'll just say, reaction from adults, right? That
Yep.
have kids that have these toys. Because I know I would not want my child's name, age, birth date, their gender, all this personal data being exposed.
Hmm.
And I think that actually helps drive some of this, some of the security around this. And because it's very concerning, anything that involves our children, obviously, I think
Yep.
goes to the top of the list, right? Outside of other issues. So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So, well, we'll still keep talking about those issues as long as they keep happening, which I think it's going to be a while.
That's right.
So, moving on to our next story, Facebook prowling predator arrested after mother helps police. So, this is a really interesting one in New York, where a sex offender was actually found to be trying to set up sexual encounters with young people, and in this case, it was a mother who happened to be, in as we advise, doing a good job of monitoring her daughter's use of Facebook and social media, and saw this interaction with a person. And turns out the person was using his real name and that he was a registered sex offender. And basically, she reported it to the police. The police set up a bit of a sting operation, I think, and were able to catch the guy. And they also discovered that this person had been doing this with numerous other people as well, trying to set up appointments or meetings with other underage people. So that all said, this kind of thing is becoming, sadly, a common thing in the news, I guess, that we're starting to see. But it just helps us remember we should be trying to keep in mind all of those tips that we have for how to monitor your children's online and social network contacts and interactions. So do we want to run through a few of these from the list on this particular story?
Yeah, I think we can cover a few of these. I think to start with, I would say it's important to have these conversations with your kids. In fact, I'd reference, this, particular situation or other situations that you might hear in the news, and have an open and honest conversation about it. I think it all starts with education, and I think a lot of times as parents, we may be afraid to have those difficult conversations, but at the end of the day, I think our kids would appreciate the honesty and understand that we do have these concerns and why we have these concerns, because these are real things that happen.
That's true. And I think, using these kinds of stories, that are in the news, pointing them out to children, saying, look, this kind of thing is happening. And therefore, let's set out some guidelines, things that you should do. And, whether you decide, you can give them those guidelines and trust them, or if you want to monitor them, that's your decision. But I think giving them the guidelines as a minimum is important.
Yeah, and we'll have a link in the show notes about these tips in this article, which I think are really good. The biggest one I would point out is not accepting friend requests from strangers and people that you don't know on social media. I think is a really good rule, not just for kids but for anybody. I use that in the professional world with LinkedIn, for example. I really will not accept requests from people that I don't know or I haven't met in person or had a telephone conversation with.
Right.
It's just good advice because, especially on Facebook, right? There's requests from people all the time that I don't know, but I don't want them seeing who my friends are or.
Yeah. especially if
personal
there's
information.
no good reason, right? I mean, on LinkedIn,
Exactly.
sometimes somebody has ostensibly has a good reason for
Hmm.
contacting you, and you can actually have a conversation with somebody without actually being a full-fledged connection with them. But in the case of children, I think, yeah, having that or any number of these guidelines is a good thing, and including don't accept connection or requests from strangers. Also, one that I like is that you should be very careful about your passwords, create proper ones, and don't share them. I've
Yeah.
seen that before, right, where kids share their passwords for Facebook for
All
whatever
the
reason.
time.
Yeah, and that's just a recipe for disaster, I think.
Yeah, I see that a lot with Instagram. With young kids, I'm talking like the preteen kids. I have a preteen myself, so the popular app is Instagram over Facebook, and actually you're not allowed to have a Facebook account. You have to be 13. Is
Hmm.
Facebook's own rules. So keep that in mind. There are some social media sites like Twitter and Facebook that actually they say you can't have an account unless you're over a certain age.
Hmm.
So keep that in mind as well. I don't recommend young kids to have Facebook accounts anyway, but yeah, Instagram is a popular one where I see kids sharing passwords, and it's very common. So just keep an eye out for that one.
Yep, and that's a good segue to our next story on a number of apps that people should be aware of that are potentially dangerous.
Yeah, we tweeted and posted this on our Facebook page, and it's gotten a lot of traction, and I'm glad a lot of people have been sharing this around. This was it's a PDF document that it's kind of nice. You can print it out, you can share it, the old-fashioned way if you want to, but it goes through and talks about, kind of the 15 most popular apps that kids are using these days. Everything from, you've heard of Snapchat, you probably have heard of Tinder, Kick Messenger, Whisper, Ask FM, Yik Yak. And, just as an example of some of the applications, we've talked about a few of these
Hmm.
just over the last couple months. If you remember Yik Yak,
Yep. Yep.
and Whisper and those, but I think this is a good education for parents to understand. Okay, what are these apps? How are they used? What is the potential for them for being misused? And that way you can, if you're looking at your son or daughter's phone or mobile device, if you have any of these apps, you can start the questioning process of, okay, why do you have this app on your device? How are you using it? Some of them have, potential legitimate uses, right?
Yep.
Some of them are like Skype, right? Where Skype has a legitimate use, like
Yep.
we're using right now.
Hmm.
But Skype could also be abused, and it's also abused by predators and people that want to do harm to your kids. So it's good to educate yourself. And some of these were a little shocking. A few that honestly I haven't quite heard of. Like, if you heard of Scout, which is it's a flirting application.
No.
Didn't really know about that, but the article kind of summarizes with some good tips at the end. Like the other article and things that we've been talking about. On the podcast. I'll also note that there are applications that allow someone to hide photos and videos and other information, an app within an app type of devices.
Hmm.
The real popular ones that I've been seeing are ones that are called Calculator or Calculator Plus, that look like kind of regular useful utilities that a kid might have. Obviously a calculator is something
Mm.
that
You
probably
need
they're
it.
going to use in school, and they
Yeah.
need it for assignments and things. But there are ones that actually will allow you to hide pictures and videos within them, and there's tons of them out there. I mean, in the show notes, I think I link one or two of them that are found in the iTunes store. But it's just something to keep aware of, that even apps that look legitimate may have a hidden purpose in them.
Yeah, yeah. And I just wanted to comment on Snapchat in particular. I mean, I used to think of it as, pretty much, why do you need to use this, and why are you concerned about, pictures getting deleted or, whatever after a few seconds, what good could come of this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm starting to realize, a lot of young people are using it because they don't want to have to actually manage their pictures, right? They want to send a picture to somebody
Yep.
about what they're doing, and they do it, and it's gone, and they don't want all their file space to get filled up with junk of pictures that are, only for the moment. So I can start to see a little more valid use of it as a tool for that reason.
Yep.
But that's not to say there isn't a bad use for it. For sure, there's things to be concerned about.
Yeah, it's also interesting with Snapchat. You mentioned that. I'm seeing more companies use Snapchat for, in advertisements saying, hey, send a snap to, this, we're on Snapchat. I'm seeing that kind of like how you see hashtags are for Twitter and Facebook on the news and in advertising. So, they're encouraging using Snapchat for legitimate purposes as well. But to your point, Scott, it can also be abused and is probably one of the most popular apps for sexting. And a little unknown fact that is good to teach your kids about is with all these applications, people can screenshot. You can screenshot anything on your phone. It's a couple button presses on an iPhone. And even though they say that these, photos will be deleted and they're expired and all those things, most of the time, people screenshot these things and then send them elsewhere. So nothing that you ever do on the internet is
completely deleted.
Completely deleted, completely private, and it's good to educate your kids about that as well, the screenshotting thing.
Yep, for sure. Good. So one more thing I just wanted to bring up. Last week I was asked to go on an interview with a journalist from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, one of our big news suppliers here in Canada, and it was a topic of privacy issues and connected devices. Basically, are connected devices mining the information that you provide or that they collect when you use them. And so we had a good discussion, and I think we talked a lot about the potential risks from different things people might not have thought of, medical devices and who knows what, door locks, etc. And so there was a lot of good discussion we had, and that was covered in the story. But one thing that they didn't cover in the story was my closing comment saying I'm not totally negative on all this stuff. I think a lot of this stuff can, certainly help us, in productivity and health, in the medical world, for example, where, some of these implantable or consumable or whatever, pills or computers in a pill that you swallow and it takes pictures of your insides. It can be very helpful from a healthcare point of view. But all I was trying to get at was, we have to hold the manufacturers' feet to the fire and make sure that they're accountable for how they're treating our private information. But what was interesting was after I posted, a link to this story on my social media, some of my associates who are security people, they didn't react quite the way you would want them to. They'd say, well, it's just FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You're just sensationalizing, the risks on these things. And it made me think, just because it wasn't covered in the story, the media tends to kind of want, these sensational things to be out there. And I don't blame them for that. But you can't just sort of look at this one data point or one story about a risky device and say, that's just fear, uncertainty, and doubt. When you look at the trend, and it's happening more and more often, and I think we're far from overreacting in the area of being overly cautious, right? We're really starting to see erosion of our privacy, and that's all I was trying to get at with by supporting this story, was hoping that we would raise awareness of these things. But you have to realize how people are going to take it.
I agree 100%. It is a different world we live in, just compared to 3 or 4 years ago. Things have drastically changed, and some of these, like you mentioned, are legitimate concerns, and we need to be discussing them.
Good. I will have a link in the show notes to that story anyway. But I think that's all the major news. It was a good episode to have under our belts.
Yeah, this was great.
So again, we want to thank Andrew Patrick from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for being on, and also welcome anybody's comments or questions. You can send email to feedback@sharedsecurity.net. And you can also leave a voicemail at 613-693-0997 by phone. So I think that wraps up everything in terms of news. Was there anything, Tom, you wanted to discuss or announce, anything like that?
Major announcements.
Major announcements. There's a meteor, an asteroid about to hit Earth.
Right. Yeah, we'll save that for the professionals. But just being a busy bee.
Yep, excellent. Well, as am I, doing a lot of work here. It gets busy in the wintertime, so it is a very busy time. So I think we're going to try and do another one of these sometime in the next month, and we hope you'll come back and have a listen.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.